So this is kind of the active life protocol briefly summarized. And again, this is really, the fundamentals of and essentials of having good health. And if we don't have these things, we don't have the kind of health that we say we want. And so if you want to be active and you want to feel good and you don't want to be in pain and you want to have, good menstrual cycles, or you don't want to gain excessive weight, you have to start addressing these fundamentals. And this is kind of the active life protocol that I've created. And this is how we start fixing the problem instead of putting a bunch of Band-Aids on it with medications, which is often what happens with medications. Okay, so again, we're going to be talking about hormonal imbalance. So let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about, and this again, I often tell this story, but I had a long consultation one time with this new client of mine, and she was telling me, we were talking all about her digestive health and all about her stress and her sleep and her nutrition and her detox abilities and her hydration and her hormones. And well, not necessarily about her hormones, but at the end of the consultation, she asked me, when are we going to talk about my hormones? And I said, well, we've been talking about your hormones this entire time. And so oftentimes people have this misconception or misunderstanding that they actually don't really know what hormones are and what they do. And so insulin resistance is one of the first problems we start to see with hormonal imbalance. And when we start seeing insulin resistance, you're more prone to experiencing things like PCOS and menstrual cycle issues and fertility issues because of what this is doing downstream to our sex hormones. And so you can just see this is outdated data here, but back in just from 83 to 2008, we saw a 7-fold increase from 35 million to 240 million. And actually now, as we speak today in 2022, this information, I don't know the exact data, but it's well over 300 million. And it's just because we continually add diabetics to our total because we keep focusing on what new drug can we provide to treat it versus why is this happening? And this is a question that Mark Hyman asked. He's a pretty famous functional medicine physician. So again, there's some more stats, like 70 to 8% of those diagnosed with type 2 diabetes have already have evidence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Basically, their liver is becoming fatty. And whenever your liver or your pancreas becomes fatty, you start seeing this fat accumulate around your midsection and around your thighs and around your butt, things like that. And unfortunately, 100 million Americans with type 2 diabetes, and there's 100 million more with pre-diabetes. And so, as you can see, just because we're not diagnosing them with diabetes type 2, we are starting to see the thick black smoke starting to accumulate, and we're not really calling the fire department until the whole house is up in flames. And so the house is in flames when you have type 2 diabetes, but the smoke is already starting to fester even when we have pre-diabetes. So again, 80% of women are experiencing hormonal imbalance. And so that's 4 out of 5, everyone. So that's a very high rate. I don't need to get into the math of that. That's most people you talk to. So if you're experiencing excessive weight gain, low energy, hair loss in your head, hair growth in your chin, low libido, sluggish bowels, you're probably experiencing a hormonal imbalance to some extent. And unfortunately, if you do not get ahead of this and you don't start becoming proactive, you're going to have a really hard time actually stopping this from getting worse. So let's actually talk about your hormones. What are hormones? That's a big question that I think a lot of people have, is like, what exactly are they? These little fairies inside of me that are controlling things or making things miserable for me. Well, in reality, hormones are just molecules of communication. They're basically just communicating what our environment is communicating back and forth with our body. And so oftentimes what these messenger molecules are trying to do is they're trying to communicate, and they're trying to create this certain level of flexibility in response to the ever-changing environment. And so our environment's always constantly changing. We're always having to respond. And if our bodies don't have flexibility with our hormones, or we're lacking the ability to make them, we start seeing a major imbalance that starts to occur. And this interconnectedness can start to shift and create a major dysfunction when it comes to our thyroid, when it comes to our sex hormones, when it comes to our adrenal glands, when it comes to our digestive health. And so it creates a lot of problems downstream. So this is a picture I got from one of my trainings in school, and it's a hormonal dance. This is kind of what we like to call it. But as you can see, I'm not going to get into all the technicalities of these different hormones, but what you need to know is that a lot's going on, and a lot can change, and a lot is influencing each other. And it's really important to just appreciate the fact that hormones are very they're in flux. Like I said, they're always trying to balance you out, and they're always trying to give you what you quote unquote want. But if you're chronically stressed and you're always in a state of sleep deprivation, your body's going to produce a ton of cortisol. That's then going to create a disruption on your estrogen, on your testosterone, on your insulin, on your progesterone, on your thyroid, and it just creates this ongoing issue. So let's talk about insulin. Insulin is a multifaceted, multi-purpose hormone for a lot of different functions. But in this context, we're going to be talking about how it's kind of related to eating and how it's related to food, because I think that's important for us to realize that before we even eat our food, our bodies are starting to secrete insulin in response to the anticipation of eating food, right? And so after we've consumed it and it's been absorbed, then our blood sugar will actually rise in the form of blood glucose. And this will then have a response from insulin to where its job is to now escort sugar out of the blood and put it into the cells. Well, once the cells are very satisfied and they've had enough sugar inside of them, and they've stored enough, they start saying, nope, I'm good, I don't need any more. And they start creating this insulin resistance, or this insulin sensitivity problem, to where now we're not able to put it in the cells, so the body starts putting it out into circulation, or the insulin starts putting it out into circulation. And this is where we start to see it store as first glycogen and then as fat via triglycerides. But the critical thing here is that when we have these high levels of insulin, it actually stops the use of fat as an energy source. And this is where you start to see a pile or an increasing of your adipose tissue around your waist, or your fat tissue around your waist, and you start seeing it build up. So let's talk about cortisol. So what does cortisol do? So cortisol is going to drive up blood sugar because it's going to, again, respond based on what your body thinks, what your brain thinks you need in a state of survival. And so if you're chronically stressed out and you're in a state of fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system response, your body's going to be chronically experiencing high levels of cortisol. And over time, this will start to erode and start to degrade your ability to make sex hormones, just because your body is not prioritizing the production of making babies and having good sex drive, when in reality it thinks it's just trying to survive. So hopefully this is starting to make sense as to why it's so important to have healthy adrenal glands, to have healthy insulin levels, and to get good sleep, because these things all work hand in hand and they all are related to hormonal balance or imbalance. And obviously the opposite of this is the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the rest, digest, procreate, and trust and thrive. This is where cortisol levels are typically a little bit lower, a little bit more balanced. But again, cortisol should be able to fluctuate back and forth and be flexible. But if it's stuck in a particular direction because of how you've been living your life, these things are going to be particularly on or off, depending on kind of what your state of life has been. And unfortunately, if you spend in high states of high cortisol for a long period of time, over time you start to see your body will kind of go what I like to call limp mode, where if you think about a transmission that's about to break, your car will often let you drive it, but it's going to put it in limp mode to where it's not going to be as fast as it usually is, because it's just trying to protect itself. And so that's what happens with your adrenal glands as well. And if you're in a state of high stress, high cortisol, your body will often go into a state of parasympathetic nervous system response, and you start seeing what's known as adrenal fatigue or adrenal exhaustion, where your body just can't make enough cortisol because it's trying to protect you. And it's not allowing you to basically take control, because when you do take control, you don't really do what the body needs to do for lasting survival and for overall high quality of life. So these are just some basic, again, this is very common, looking at the autonomic nervous system, looking at how it functions as far as whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. And you can kind of see here, when we're in a parasympathetic nervous system, we are resting and digesting, we are having antioxidant function, we're making hormones, we're healing, we're having relaxation, we're calm, we're detoxing. But if we're not doing that and we're exercising and we're having pro-oxidant effect, where we're trying to build up toxicity and waste, and we're having a lot of stimulation, it's really hard to heal when we're in that state. And same thing with making hormones. It just doesn't happen all that well. So another common one that we've all heard and maybe don't know a lot about is melatonin. So melatonin is a key antioxidant that actually lowers your cortisol and your blood pressure at night, and it actually promotes lower insulin. And so this will support fasting and blood sugar over regulation overnight. And this is why it's key to consider doing phases of fasting or intermittent fasting, to where you're allowing your body to actually regulate insulin and start to reduce it over time. And the tricky thing here is a lot of people they'll do melatonin supplementation, and oftentimes they'll do like 10 milligrams or 5 milligrams, which is way too much for most people. And this can actually have a negative effect by promoting blood sugar, and then because it's overly suppressing insulin and it's going too far in the opposite direction. So you want to be careful of this as well. All right, so just one point of conversation here on the topic of your hormones and how to work with them. If you are going to be eating food, just one thing to consider: if you are a regular daytime worker, and for the nighttime workers, just kind of apply these same hours. If you have a lunchtime at 3 a.m., just kind of compare that to the lunchtime that I'm providing here. And same thing with your bedtime. If your bedtime's at 7 a.m., it's kind of just give yourself that calculation in your mind compared to what this daytime schedule will look like for people that I've provided here. But basically, if your melatonin is going to increase around 6 o'clock at night, which it typically does, you're going to be decreasing your insulin sensitivity. And over time, this will start to make, if you're eating a lot of calories at night, will make your storage of glycogen and as triglycerides, as fat, more likely. And so if you're eating a lot after not at 6 o'clock at night and you're eating at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock before bed, maybe even you're waking up in the middle of the night, you're going to have a really hard time putting this sugar, this glycogen in your cell, and it's going to be storing as fat around your liver or around your waist. And so this one tip can be a huge change for people if you just start to limit your calories after 6 o'clock at night. And the best way to kind of work in your favor is if you're utilizing, just say 1 o'clock is like your midpoint in the day, like when you wake up, maybe say you wake up at 7 a.m., you go to bed at 9 a.m., 10 p.m., 1 o'clock would be kind of your peak of your cortisol level, and it kind of falls off throughout the day. But as such, cortisol actually kind of rises really high in the morning, and it can kind of taper off throughout the day. But this is kind of just an example of this. But typically, your cortisol will be around the highest around midday, and so your cortisol is going to make insulin more likely to utilize glycogen for energy, and it's going to be more likely to store it in the cell and not around your waist or around your liver, things like that. So I typically say eat about 80% of your calories for the day before 1 o'clock, and then try to limit your calories after 6 o'clock at night. But what exactly is insulin resistance? And so in a healthy cell, like I said, your cell's opening up to allowing glucose to transport into the cell. And as time goes on, you become more insulin resistant. You start seeing less sugar absorption in this because the cell is full. And so you have more sugar remaining in circulation, and this ends up being stored as fat. And so again, if you're trying to become less insulin resistant, you really want to make sure that you're not sitting too often, because your large muscles of the leg are where insulin resistance develops first. And so if we want to try to work on this, you want to start improving your muscle mass in your legs, and you'll start seeing a much faster improvement with insulin sensitivity, which is a good thing. But let's keep this simple, right? So if we're eating refined or excessive carbohydrates, or we have chronic stress, we have a sedentary life, we're experiencing toxicity, whether in the form of relationships or food or just environmental toxicity, this will all lead to the likelihood of our body experiencing higher levels of glucose. And this will make lots and lots of insulin to respond to it. And over time, our cells start to resist the effects of insulin, and the level just gets higher and higher. And so glucose rises, excessive sugar gets stored as fat on the body, and we start to feel hungry, we start to feel weak and more tired, and we develop more body fat. And so this is a very vicious cycle that occurs with insulin resistance. But I thought it was all about carbs, right? Everybody always is talking about carbs. And I want to tell you something really quick. This is just one example I provided, some research I provided to you, and it shows this tribe that was back in Arizona about 100 years ago. They were thin, fit, and healthy. Today, they are the second most obese population in the world, with 80% of their population of the adults over the age of 30 have diabetes, and the average life expectancy is only 46 years old. So, like, what's happened? Well, before their prior diet, they actually had a lot of whole grains. Their squash, their fish, their melons, chia seed, legumes, beans, hot and mild chilies, and herbs. And the diet was whole, it was unrefined, it was unprocessed. And it was actually high in carbs. It was 75% carbs. But they had periods of time where they had scarce food, and so they had periods of fasting. And so their body was going through the state of hormesis, where basically they was experiencing a good challenge that was appropriate, that was putting their body into more of a state of metabolic flexibility, right? But now their current diet is a typical SAD diet. It's a standard American diet. It's fast and processed. It's hardly real. It's full of processed carbs, and they're not only refined at high, or they're not only high glycemic load, but they're also refined. And I always tell my clients in my program, don't count your calories, count your chemicals, because your chemicals are what's going to increase insulin resistance and make it more likely for you to have hormonal imbalances. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about diet. So a lot of people are into keto, right? Most of you probably watching this video are into keto. If you're like a lot of my clients in the past or in the program, they have come to me because they tried keto, they had some early success, and then later on down the road, they found out it was too hard to maintain. They couldn't do it. They felt starving, and they ended up having, maybe some significant weight loss, but then they gained most of it back, or maybe a little bit more, because what they were doing is most people are not ready to be consuming a higher fat diet, because it requires proper fat digestion and absorption. But also, it makes sure you have to ensure that you're getting good, sufficient sleep, and that you're having good, sufficient stress management, and that you're able to have proper B vitamins and L-carnitine and iron, and your ability to actually have good bile support and all these kind of things. So if you don't have those things, then it makes having a higher fat diet really difficult, because your body's not quite ready for it. And so a truly ketogenic diet is less than 10% carbs, and it's dependent on these factors. But The problem is that animals store toxins in their fat as well. So food quality is really key. So if you're trying to eat a higher fat diet, ensure that you're eating really good quality of meat sources, because the toxins that can be stored in the fat and the animal meat that you're eating can then be brought in and stored in your fat and create a toxic burden. And so the problem is that when you have high insulin, it actually impairs fatty acid oxidation, meaning that it makes it difficult for you to actually utilize fat as an energy source. And so it's really important to just, again, and as we talk all about this in the program, like how to do this properly, what supplements to take, and how to get your body ready for this, so that when you do start to a diet like this, or you start to eat a more balanced diet, that your body is ready for it and it's actually serving you well. All right, so most people have a varying need for carbohydrates based on their genetics and their activity level and their cortisol levels and their adrenal function, and also their current use of their diabetic medications. And so if you're trying to just go cold turkey and cut out carbs altogether, you're probably going to suffer. And there's a lot of there's some studies that show that if you're doing a long-term ketogenic diet, it actually can impair thyroid function, especially converting T4 to T3, and can disrupt your gut health. And so it's really important to have sufficient fiber, and making sure that your body is ready for these kind of diets, and that you're also doing them intelligently, and you're doing them correctly, because again, a lot of people just don't do them right, and they're leading themselves down the wrong road. And so again, this is what we talk about in the program. This is what we help people do, women specifically. But again, I just want to make sure you guys are aware of this. Okay, so if you have any kind of lab work and you want to know if you're insulin resistant, this is what I have my clients typically look at, or I'll look at it for them. But typically, if you're experiencing triglycerides over 100, or your fasting blood glucose in combination with your triglycerides being over 100, is an indication that you're probably experiencing some insulin resistance. Fasting blood glucose is very variable because of all the different factors that contribute to having an increase in your fasting blood sugar. But if you're having an A1C greater than 5.5 in combination with these other factors, you're probably likely experiencing insulin resistance on some form and capacity. But I also recommend people look at their liver enzymes, and if they're on the upper third of the quadrant here, or on the reference range, you can start to indicate that there's probably some level of fatty liver going on, and it's again due to the insulin resistance developing. All right, so where do you begin? To keep it simple, start with these initial steps. Eat real food. I cannot express enough how important this is, just to stop eating processed food on a daily basis. If your food is coming from the pantry where it's been in a bag, and that's primarily where you're getting it from, you're not having to cook it, you're not eating it raw, you're not eating real food, and it's processed. That's as simple as I can make it. And the second thing is get good sleep. If you can start to implement good sleep, and again, this is something I go over extensively in the course, but if you can start to prioritize your sleep, you start to really heal, and you start to make hormones, and you start to have good immune function. So focus on your sleep and eating hygiene. Again, it's a huge topic I talk about in the whole course, but if you're wanting, it's just basically eating your food and not in rush states, and making sure that you have proper bile and you have good stomach acid, all those kind of things. Obviously move. We want to get your body moving. We want to address those lower leg muscles and start to improve insulin sensitivity, and start to get your body a little bit healthier. And so it can start to improve growth hormone and things like that. And so we talk about that in the course, and we talk about reducing stress, and a whole section on reducing stress, and having a metabolic diet, and considering supplements. All these things are super important as far as where you need to begin to start seeing this change. And again, this is why we have a whole program dedicated to this, because it does take a step-by-step process that we've identified and developed that has been very effective for our clients. And so if you want to be a part of that, let me know. But otherwise, that's where I would have you start if you were in the program. And so again, this is just kind of a reference back to that original protocol that I've created, and kind of how we get at